Mrs. Louse and Mr. Flea. Once upon a time, there were two friends named Mrs. Louse and Mr. Flea who lived in a faraway country. One day, Mrs. Louse and Mr. Flea decided to visit the bedbug. Mrs. Louse and Mr. Flea lived on one side of the river and the bedbug lived on the other side of the river. Mrs. Louse and Mr. Flea left for the bedbug. They arrived at the bank of the river. Mr. Flea crossed the other side of the river quickly. When Mrs. Louse saw Mr. Flea crossing the other side of the river quickly, she stretched and jumped the other side as well. As soon as she jumped, she fell down into the river, started to struggle and called Mr. Flea for help in the river. She asked for help to save her. Mr. Flea was scared and he couldn't decide what to do. Then he started to run to the bush. He thought to get some brushwood to give her so he would save her. Mr. Flea said, "Bush, bush, give me some brushwood. Mrs. Louse fell down into the river. I will save her." The bush said to Mr. Flea, "Tell the black crow not to land on and bother me. If he doesn't bother me, I will give you some brushwood." Mr. Flea went to the black crow and said, "Sweet crow, don't land on the bush, please. If you don't land on him, he will give me some brushwood, and I will save Mrs. Louse with that brushwood." The black crow was hungry. He turned to Mr. Flea and said, "Tell the owner of the storehouse to give me some wheat. If the owner of the storehouse gives me some wheat, I will not land on the bush. Then the bush gives you some brushwood, and then you will save your friend." Mr. Flea couldn't wait. He jumped once and then jumped twice. At last he arrived at the storehouse. He told the owner of the storehouse, "Give the crow some wheat, so the crow will not land on the bush. The bush will give me some brushwood as well. Mrs. Louse fell down into the river. I will save her." Just then, the owner of the storehouse was angry with the mouse in the storehouse. He turned to Mr. Flea and said, "Tell that cheeky mouse not to eat my wheat. If he doesn't eat my wheat, I will give the crow some wheat, so the crow doesn't land on the bush, and the bush will give you some brushwood, and then you will give your friend some brushwood and save her." So Mr. Flea found the mouse and said, "Sweet mouse, don't eat wheat in the storehouse. Then the storehouse owner will give me some wheat. I will give the wheat to the crow, so the crow will not land on the bush, and the bush will give me some brushwood. At last I will go and save my friend." The mouse got out of his hole in fear and said, "Tell the grumpy cat not to chase me. If the cat doesn't chase me, I won't eat wheat in the storehouse. The owner of the storehouse will give the crow some wheat. Then the crow will not land on the bush. The bush will give you some brushwood and you will save Mrs. Louse." Mr. Flea begged the cat this time, "Cat, please don't chase and scare the mouse. If you don't scare him, he will not eat the wheat of the storehouse. The owner of the storehouse will give me some wheat. I will get the wheat and take it to the crow. The crow will not land on the bush. At last, I will get the brushwood from the bush and save Mrs. Louse." Was the cat sorry for Mr. Flea? No, of course not. He looked at Mr. Flea and said, So, bring me some cheese. Then I won't chase the mouse. The mouse doesn't eat wheat in the storehouse. The owner of the storehouse will give some wheat to the crow. If the crow doesn't land on the bush, he will give you brushwood and you will save Mrs. Louse. Mr. Flea went to the grocery store and asked for a slice of cheese. The grocer said, I have a loyal dog. If you promise to stay away from my dog, I will give you some cheese. Mr. Flea promised, and the grocer gave him some cheese. Mr. Flea brought and put the cheese in front of the cat. The cat ate the cheese with great pleasure. The cat gave up chasing the mouse when he was full. So the mouse didn't eat wheat in the storehouse, and the owner of the storehouse gave some wheat to the crow as he promised. The black crow got the wheat and didn't land on the bush anymore. So the bush gave Mr. Flea the brushwood. At last, Mr. Flea ran to the river with the brushwood. What was it? The water level of the river rose while Mr. Flea was trying to get the brushwood, and Mrs. Louse was too tired. Mr. Flea came close to the river without thinking and tried to give the brushwood to Mrs. Louse. She wanted to reach the brushwood, but the water was flowing so fast and she was scared that the waves would take her away. At last, Mr. Flea passed the brushwood along to Mrs. Louse. She hardly jumped on the brushwood and survived finally. And then they all lived happily ever after, and the same to all the friends who make sacrifices for their loved ones.
Tam üç elma gökten düşer, Anadolu masalları. Kahramanlar dağlar aşar, Anadolu masalları. Bir varmış da bir yokmuş, Anadolu masalları.